Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer. And today I want to talk about the 5 elements of self-care. And the 5 elements of self-care are physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social or relational. Now, lots of times when we think about self-care, the first thing that comes to mind is like taking a hot bath, which might be relaxing, but I don't actually find it a very helpful way to think about self-care. And a few years ago, I started to think about myself this way: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, social. And it's been incredibly helpful because at any given time, I can ask myself, what am I doing to care for this aspect of myself today? So the first element of self-care, physical, is what most of us think of when we think about caring for ourselves. Paying attention to what we eat, exercising our bodies, managing any medical imbalances or issues we might have. Even yoga and meditation are often approached from a stress reduction standpoint, which is often more of a physical approach to self-care. And physical self-care is absolutely necessary because if the car isn't driving correctly, then you can't get anywhere. And our body is the vehicle that brings us through the world. And the thing to remember about self-care and why I like to think more globally or about all of the aspects of the self is because we are not compartmentalized. Each of the aspects of our self is part of a greater whole, and the health of each individual element affects the functioning of the whole, often dramatically. So one of the downsides of scientific materialism is that everything gets compartmentalized. We look at a whole, we divide it down into its different parts, which is great for being able to learn about stuff and examine it, but we lose the context that the whole is actually greater than the sum of its parts. So we have a physical aspect, mental aspect, emotional, spiritual, social aspects. We can look at them individually, but they don't operate individually. It's kind of like you have a digestive system and a pulmonary system and a nervous system, and you can look at them separately and learn a lot, but by themselves, they mean nothing. A nervous system and a digestive system cannot operate without the whole body, and it's true for each of these elements within ourself as well. So as we think about self-care from these 5 elements, we're really taking a holistic approach to the person. And the really cool thing is that any improvement in any one of these areas affects the whole system in a positive way. So for example, proper exercise and good eating affect your mental health. They affect your emotional health. And we can look at each of these elements in that way. So if I gather nourishing mental or intellectual information, then that can impact my desire to take care of myself. How I think about things and my perception is a mental function, which has a big impact on how I feel emotionally. If I'm in a good place emotionally, it affects my desire to exercise, to care for myself. I know for me, my emotional state has profound impact on my ability to function cognitively. The holistic approach, of course, works the other direction as well, in that if my physical health is poor, it can really affect me mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and socially. If my social life is really disturbed, then I can be cognitively disrupted and feel bad physically, et cetera, et cetera. So I've just found it really helpful to think about all the different ways that I can care for myself. We don't need to be perfect in any of them. In fact, I find it really helpful to take kind of doable, snackable goals and just pick one. Pick one thing that I can improve on, or just one positive step in one area today. Maybe I'll take a walk. Maybe I'll eat vegetables instead of Oreo cookies. Because any improvement in any of these areas improves the function of the whole. So caring for ourselves physically. There's a ton of information out there about exercise and nutrition. I'm not an expert in either of those, but I absolutely know how important it is. And I've even just recently started to really work with changing my diet. The last few years I've been doing intermittent fasting. And there's a couple different ways to do intermittent fasting. There's a lot of research out of the Institute on Aging and from lots of other places about the benefits of fasting, both in longevity, in increasing the length of your life, and just in overall health. I've tried a couple different kinds. I tried 5-2 eating, which is when you eat normally 5 days and then 2 days a week you calorie restrict. My body didn't really like that very much. I found that I got like freezing cold about halfway through the day. My body temperature would drop. So what I've been doing now, actually for probably going on a couple years, is intermittent fasting daily, which is 16-8 eating, which is that I try to eat all my meals within an 8-hour time span. A lot of times, actually, for me, it's more like 6. I generally only eat 2 meals a day with a snack in between. And then the other 16 or 18 hours, you don't eat. Now, I've been told that there's no benefit over 16 hours, but one of the things that 16-8 eating does, and intermittent fasting in general, is that it actually depletes your liver of the usual sugars that it uses to power itself, and it starts to actually burn body fat. I don't understand all the science of it, but it's kind of the idea of healthy stress, that stressing your body in a healthy way, just like lifting weights. I'm super into lifting weights. It stresses your body in a healthy way. And healthy stress actually makes you stronger rather than depleting you, like unhealthy stress. So we got to find the right edge to lean on to actually be pushing our body, our mind, our emotions, our spirit, and our social life in order to be growing and maintaining optimal health. I like the idea of leaning in, and I think leaning into our growing edge, pushing ourselves, is key to optimizing all these different elements. So the second element of self-care is your mental state. Meditation can be really good for your mental state. Exercise is also really good for your mental state. But are you taking in information? What's the quality of the information that you're taking in? What do you spend most of your time thinking about? Can you become conscious of your mental state? And do you need to get some therapy? Do you need to be reading some positive inspirational books or some poetry or looking at artwork, exposing your mind to creativity and beauty? Are you just passively taking information in? And what kind of information are you expressing in the world? I love the idea that life is a process of breathing in and breathing out in all these different ways. And so thinking about, what am I consuming? What am I producing? What am I breathing in mentally? What am I putting out mentally? And how to care for ourselves intellectually in the same way that we care for our bodies. So consuming things that are nourishing and wholesome, even organic to some extent, that really resonate with us. If you've listened to me for any period of time, you know I don't watch scary movies. I've dedicated my life to helping people deal with trauma, but you got to pay me if you want me to sit with your trauma. I'm not paying to go see it. The third element of self-care is emotionally. How do I care for myself emotionally? Do I actually make time to feel my feelings? Do I get in touch with my emotional experience? Do I give myself permission to belly laugh or deeply cry or feel my anger or sit deeply in peace and beauty and inspiration, like in nature or with beautiful music or poetry? What are my emotional interactions with people in my life? Do I have toxic relationships that are constantly putting me in a position of angst or frustration or feeling victimized? If I'm an adult, I'm not powerless. I have choices to make and a responsibility to care for myself emotionally. Do I need help in emotional development? Am I still kind of emotionally immature and acting out of old wounding and repeating patterns that I don't want to repeat anymore in my relationships, in my emotional experience of life, and even within myself? Do I have self-hatred or self-rejection? Or am I kind and loving and compassionate? So considering about how we care for ourselves emotionally, to take the time to be an attentive, present parent to myself. I love journaling. I find that a really helpful way to get in touch with what I'm feeling. And actually just sitting for a couple minutes each day and asking myself, like really checking in with my body felt experience of my emotions and just making room for them, that there doesn't have to be any judgment, Emotions are incredible sources of information about us, but they're kind of like the weather. And I live in San Francisco and we get all kinds of weather. And each kind of weather gives the day a different experience. Emotions add color and texture and flavor to our life. And we often just want to spend time with the good, happy ones and avoid the like quote unquote bad, uncomfortable ones. But we really need to make room for all of our experience. Just like if we only eat dessert or do one kind of exercise, then we're going to have imbalance. Imbalance leads to dis-ease or disease, which is when we lose our health. The fourth element of self-care is spiritual. And this is a very broad and wide spectrum. Spiritual is not equal to religious, although if you are religious, certainly then you already have a spiritual foundation or a spiritual practice. And how alive is it for you if you are religious? Are you just saying rote prayers? Are you just going to church because of guilt and wanting to check off the box that you did that? Or are you really nourished by the spiritual practice that you have? Spiritual practice is what connects us with joy and wisdom and inspiration. I live near the ocean, and for a lot of people, I know their spiritual practice is surfing and being in the immensity of the Pacific Ocean. I worked with a client yesterday whose spiritual practice is gardening. And she loves her plants. She's just had some seedlings come up. It's a source of real joy and creativity. And she really communes and connects with the energy of the plants. She's learning about herbs and she makes tinctures and teas and is growing food that she eats. Gardening is this whole deep spiritual experience and connecting with nature for her. My spiritual practice involves a combination of shamanic journeying and doing service work with other people, and just often sitting and seeing what creativity or inspiration wants to move through me. Creativity is absolutely, for me, in the spiritual realm. For different people, it might be emotional or mental. And the mental, emotional, spiritual, those all can kind of blend into each other, and they look different for each person. One of the most spiritual women I ever met was a devout atheist, but she cared deeply for social justice and other people, and that was her spiritual practice. She would hate it that I called it that, but she did a lot of good in the world, and she was very inspired and compassionate and deeply spiritual from my perspective. So how do you care for yourself spiritually? What speaks to your heart? What speaks to your soul? Where are you inspired and where do you inspire others? Yoga was my spiritual practice for about 5 years before I had a C-section with my first son, and then I couldn't do yoga for about 10 years because they cut me in half and it fucked up my abdominal muscles. So again, these aren't solid compartments. Running can be a spiritual practice. I know I have a good friend who's a distance runner. I have another friend who's a distance biker, and biking is his meditation. I have a dear friend who loves to be out on ATVs, out in the nature, in the sand. And riding an ATV or a sand car at 50 miles an hour is actually a spiritual practice for him. So what's your spiritual practice? How do you feed your spirit? And the fifth element of self-care is social or relational. How do you care for yourself socially? Do you have a community that's loving and supportive? Do you have relationships that are stimulating and enjoyable for you? And social relational, it's a big element, and we often don't think of it as part of our self-care. We are social beings. I know that has been the most excruciating part of the COVID experience for me, has been being separated from my community. I have a couple of groups that I go to that are large, like one of them has over 100 people, and I go every week, and then we would go out to breakfast after. We've actually just started to get together again, and I'm so excited because being with a group of people is totally different than being with one or two. I'm hypersocial, and I get a lot out of being with a big group of people. So how do you care for yourself socially? How do you care for yourself relationally? And I challenge you to think about each of these elements every day. And sometimes doing things daily is way too much. I often do things weekly. So like getting together with groups of people for me optimally is 1 to 3 times a week. Although I need to talk to another person and have a deep, genuine connection with someone every day. If I don't have a genuine, authentic connection with someone every day, I feel lonely. And loneliness is incredibly depleting. How do we care for ourselves? Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, socially, or relationally? Think about your 5 fingers and take a little inventory and check in. I've found this to be a really simple, helpful, and effective checklist for how I'm doing and how I'm caring for myself. I hope it's helpful for you. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.